month review for September. If you'll recall correctly, it was Arrival by Ted Chiang, previously known as The Story of Your Life and Others. It is a short story science fiction anthology that I was a little hesitant to read. I don't typically review anthologies, and I don't typically read a lot of short stories, even though I've been enjoying listening to them on LeVar Burton's podcast, LeVar Burton Reads. But I was completely blown away by this book. The stories in here were amazing. I loved most of them, with only a few kind of not really clicking with me, but even those were supremely well written, and anybody who likes the genre would probably enjoy these, although I could do with a different cover. Movie covers are not my favorite. Alright, and because the book is a short story anthology, I'm going to review it a little bit differently than I typically do with my book of the month. I'm going to not do book club questions, just because it would be very hard to kind of answer them about these, because they're all written differently in their different stories. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do 2 pros, 2 cons, summary, rating, and then a brief kind of reasoning behind my ratings. And then at the end, I'll kind of give you my overall impression of the book, the author, and my overall rating for the book itself. So the first story in this book was The Tower of Babylon. It is a story from the perspective of someone who is a follower of a religion. I believe the god's name is Yahweh, so very similar setting and to Babylon in our world, but not quite the same. They have this gigantic tower in Babylon that reaches up to the heavens, and he is part of a team who is going to excavate what's at the top of the tower to try to get into the heavens. It's a very interesting story of their journey up there, the different people, and the way they look at society and how their faith works. The story itself is just kind of commentary on faith and defying God and the cyclical nature of having faith. I found it very interesting as someone who does not personally hold faith myself. And within this, my 2 pros are that the story itself was very well written, easy to follow. He made this world very easy to get used to, even though he didn't have many pages to do it. And then my second pro for this is that I really enjoyed the main character himself. He had a very interesting perspective, and it made the book and the story move in such a way that you never were unsure of what was going on, except if he was unsure. There was never anything that you would be unsure of just because it wasn't well explained. That was not the issue. It was you were experiencing the same things he was experiencing, and it made for a very, very interesting read. My cons is that the pacing is a bit slow. I did mention that in my summary. It was well written, but it was very slow, and I felt like it took a long time to get where the story ended up. And I do understand, having finished that story, that it was deliberately written that way, but it just made it very hard for me to get into the story in the beginning. And then my other con was the story. Just because I'm someone who doesn't hold faith myself, I found the story very hard to get into. By the end, I found it kind of interesting, but it was not my favorite story. Thankfully, the character was really, really interesting, and the book story itself was very well written outside of what the plot was. So it did make it a reasonably enjoyable read. The Tower of Babylon short story got a 3 out of 5 stars for me, for the reasons I talked about. Well written with a good cast, specifically the main character whose perspective you are from, even though the plot itself was not something that I found particularly engaging. The second short story is Understand. It's about a man who was brain dead, and he was given these regenerative drugs, and it turns him into a genius essentially, and it's him dealing with the world. There isn't really much more I want to say about this. The 2 pros I have is that the story itself was really interesting. I liked the idea of his paranoid logic, and that made his character very interesting to read. And then the story itself I found very interesting. The main character's story arc through it was very, very interesting. This idea of essentially returning from the dead and then achieving these amazing feats of intelligence, and it kept me hooked. It was just an incredibly interesting read, and as somebody who works in the medical field, the use of the medical world in this one really, in particular, kept me engaged. My 2 cons for this is that it was a bit jumpy. Some of the transitions were pretty abrupt, and it would pull me out every once in a while, but it wasn't nothing major, just enough that every once in a while I'd be like, oh. And then the other negative I had is that the main character, even though I enjoyed his paranoid logic, he was a bit of an ass, and I found that made him very unlikable. And while I don't mind an unlikable character, I really wanted to be able to sympathize and empathize with this character and then like be excited when he grew, and instead I just went, you're an insufferable ass the whole time. That's really all it is. My two cons really weren't that bad, weren't that major in terms of how much I enjoyed the other things about the novel. This short story is a 4 out of 5 stars for the reasons I kind of talked about, being the plot and the paranoid logic were really entertaining, even though the character himself was an ass and the abrupt jumps sometimes pulled me out of my reading flow. The next short story is Division by Zero. This is one of the shortest, and it is probably one of my least favorite in the book. Actually, no, this is my least favorite in the book. It is about a woman who has become depressed and suicidal because she made this discovery in mathematics that basically removed all meaning from her life currently and everything she had done to get to this point. My pauses here were how they dealt with mental illness. It was done fairly effectively. It wasn't done in a demeaning way. It was just discussed as a natural part of life and human experience. The other positive I have was the few flashbacks that they give you where you kind of have her discovering these things that leads up to the break. And I found that part of the story really interesting, but everything after the break was very hard to read and I did not enjoy it, which is my first negative. The present day in the story. For the things I just said, I found them very boring and just those parts did not engage me enough to really be committed to the character by the time they do the flashbacks. The time jumps from present day to past, I found it made the pacing a bit strange because some of it was, the past was more quickly paced and the future, or the current state was pretty slowly paced, and it was just a very strange contrast that I just could not get behind. And between that and the other thing I didn't like with basically being bored while I was reading it, I ended up giving this short story a very low mark. I gave it a 2 out of 5 stars. It is not the worst thing I've ever read, but if I reread this book, I will not be rereading that short story. So now I'm getting into the ones I enjoyed the most. That would be A Story of Your Life. It is from the perspective of a woman who is part of the first encounter team with a alien species. She's a linguist, so she's finding out and learning how to communicate with them. And within this, one of the languages she learns kind of makes her question time and space, and the timeline gets very blurred as opposed to the abrupt jumps in one of the previous books I talked about. These jumps still weren't great, but they were so deliberate that I couldn't help but appreciate them even if I didn't like them while I was reading. And this will lead me to just go into to say straight out, that was the only con I had for this book, was the jumpiness with the timelines, making it a little hard to follow. My prose, I could have gone on forever with the prose, but I liked the poignant storytelling with your main character and her relationship with her daughter. Those things just made my heart warm because they were so realistic and so relatable. There's a few of the situations where I've had with my own mother, and that made me connect much more deeply with this main character. My other pro that I picked to list was their dissection of language and how they were analyzing it. I did some linguistics in university and I absolutely adored it. So anytime linguistics is kind of a big thing in the story, I'm definitely going to pick it up, and I usually enjoy it, as with this short story. This short story was a 5 out of 5 stars for me. I loved it from beginning to end, easily one of my favorites in this book. The next is 72 Letters. It is basically a world where Jewish beliefs and theology, along with the Hebrew language, is actually kind of more what is focused in our world of science and advancement. The phrase 72 letters refers to a phrase that they can write to give life to objects. The man that you follow is someone who specifically designs, they call them automata. They're basically robots. And you have this phrase that you put in them, and then they will come alive and do a very specific task. I really found this story very interesting. My first pro was the logic behind the world and how they advanced to what I would consider to be like the early to mid 1900s. And the fact that they were doing this with these deep and complex theological teachings and not science, or not modern science as we know it. My other pro was the plot. I really enjoyed the story arc and this idea of good and bad, and actually how our protagonist fits into that and how he is both good and bad given different situations, and I found that really, really interesting. My two negatives here were that one of the villains, what you would probably consider the big villain, was very superficial. He wasn't as in-depth, and I hoped he'd have a more complex kind of outcome, and it was not as complex as I would have hoped given how much work was put into the world. And my other negative was that it took a while to get going. It was slower at the beginning, and this was only because they were setting up a lot of background for the main character that you're following, because that gave you a lot better it ended up giving you a lot better grasp of the world he was in, but it probably could have been done in a more compact, shorter way and still given you the information you needed. But honestly, overall, I really loved this book, or this short story. I gave this another 5 out of 5 stars. These two were easily my favorite, this one and the previous, and I loved the kind of moral versus amoral, I loved the story, and I loved the logic behind the world and behind how everything worked. It was super interesting and very intricate, and I just wish that could have also been given to the villain, because I think a more intricate outcome, a more complex outcome would have really just tied everything together perfectly. The next short story I'm going to talk about is The Evolution of Human Science. This is the shortest short story in the novel. It is 7 pages long, and it's more of a commentary on man's role in science once we've kind of pushed science beyond where we're able to comprehend things. It's very meh. Like, I didn't dislike it. I would say I liked it more than Divided by Zero, but it wasn't super attention grabbing. My positive for it is that really it was short and sweet, and it was an interesting concept about how logically we push science beyond where we're able to study it. My negatives were that it was very meh. Like, it was short and sweet, but nothing happened. And the conclusion that they found was kind of like a self-fulfilling prophecy and a desperate grab at remaining relevant. And then the other negative I had is they talk about these metahumans in this, and this is part of why science is pushed beyond normal humans, is because these metahumans exist. And I just wish we had gotten more of a background behind kind of the norms behind the decisions behind why these metahumans were created and why it was okay for them to be created and all of that jazz. But you didn't get a lot of background. I ended up giving this story a 2.5 out of 5. It is dead smack middle of the road. It was meh. It wasn't bad. It wasn't good, but it was short and sweet, so it was an easy read. The next one is Hell is the Absence of God. This is probably my 3rd favorite short story in the book. You follow a man who is having a severe emotional crisis after his wife is killed in an accident that was through an act of God via the angels that visit our realm. They bring both cures and curses. And his wife just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, and she has ascended to heaven, leaving him on the earthly plane. I thought this was a very, very interesting story. I thought they did a really good job representing grief and how it takes different forms and how you need different things to help different people, because even if you are at the same stage of grieving as someone else, different resolutions are required to kind of bring you back to that, the balance that keeps you a little bit more functioning. I also really enjoyed how the world was built. It required kind of minimal world building because it was in a world that was very similar to ours, and most people, even those who do not hold faith, have a very solid concept of what heaven and hell are to represent and what they are. So you had a very good idea of what was going on and why these two different entities of heaven and hell were both good and bad in each person's view. What I didn't like was the pacing. It was a little bit slower than I would have liked. I think it was this, and that resulted in the story being a little bit longer than it necessarily needed to be. That being said, it was still very interesting. My other negative is I wish we could have gotten more of a background on the couple that was the main character and his now deceased wife. I think that would have been very interesting because although I really sympathized with him, I would have liked to kind of sympathize the situation a little bit more and sympathized with the grief expressed at the loss of this perfect union of two beings. And I really, really would have liked to have had a bit more of a background on her to understand his grief a little bit better. That being said, I still really enjoyed it, even though my two cons are a little bit more major than some of my other cons. The overall story was just very interesting, and I found this one had an incredible ending. I really felt it tied everything together, and it was what I hoped for an ending in a story like this. And as such, I gave this story a 4.5 out of 5 stars. For the reasons I talked about, it was just a very, very enjoyable read. The last short story, it's called Liking What You See, a documentary. It is a written documentary style story about having an implant that causes telecognition, I believe is how you say it. It inhibits your ability to perceive beauty, even though you can still recognize the face of the person you're looking at. So it's not like you have an issue identifying them. It's just your perception of beauty is turned off. I really liked the story in that it tackled something that's very relevant. There are very, very big conversations surrounding media and beauty and how it fits into society. And I found this was a very interesting commentary on it. And I also loved the documentary style setup. I love this kind of writing set up in these interview styles. One of my favorite books, World War Z, is written like this. And it's just, there's something about it that always catches my attention and just pulls me in, even though it's a documentary of a fictional environment, a fictional story. My negatives here were the pacing again. I found it a little bit slow and not a lot happened. And my other negative was I didn't care for the decision making of the characters. This one is a very personal opinion. It's not really a technical thing. And it just has to do with the characters that you're introduced to and how they deal with their situation. And some of them, I just made these decisions that made me roll my eyes. Nothing major, just I didn't like the decisions they made. And that leads me to my rating. There isn't really anything else I want to say about the story. This one was a 3.5 out of 5 for me, for the reasons I listed above. Very interesting story, very relevant topic. All right, so overall, I really enjoyed this anthology of short stories. I think Ted Chiang is a very talented writer with a very creative mind. He made all of these very interesting worlds and interactions that just pulled me in. Overall, I really enjoyed this book. My average rating for it is a 4 out of 5. Actually, it's 3.68, but I rounded up and then rounded up to get a whole number. And I would really recommend this to anybody who really enjoys science fiction, who really enjoys short stories. I found this very enjoyable, and they really made me think about my current state and where I see the future going, and the commentaries on society really got me thinking. It is just something I would really recommend to anybody who enjoys this style of writing. And that is all I have to say. Thanks for tuning in to my Book of the Month review, and I will see you guys in the next video. Bye!